Minari actress 윤여정's win at the Academy Awards on Monday was a historic moment as she became the first Korean in history to win an Oscar for acting. As the news of her Best Supporting Actress title broke around the world, it gave way to a nationwide celebration here in South Korea. This year's lineup of Oscar nominees and winners was arguably the most diverse in the award's 93-year history, amid growing calls for racial justice, equity and inclusion in American society. We discussed what the award ceremony means for the representation of diversity in Hollywood. And for this, we connect with Jacob Sarkisian, an entertainment reporter at Insider, who's joining us from London. And we also have Professor Sean Metzger, Professor and Associate Dean at UCLA School of Theatre, Film and Television, joining us from Los Angeles. Now, to go straight into the questions, Jacob, now Minari was up for multiple awards at this year's Academy Awards, and well, even before the award ceremony, there was a lot of attention on Yoon, who Minari's film director Isaac Chung called the film's secret weapon. And it turns out he was quite right. And I know that you enjoyed Minari yourself, so I'd really love to hear your reaction to this. And while Yoon said that she didn't see the nomination as competition for the award, I want to know what you think made her really stand out among the likes of Glenn Close, Amanda Seyfried and Olivia Colman.
Absolutely. So much, I think, about the Oscars are timing, and luckily for Yeojung, it wasn't Glenn Close's year this year, yet again. 8 acting nominations and still no win. So it wasn't her time. And what really helped Yeojung is that she's basically brand new to the Oscars scene and to Western film audiences. Her performance was full of humour and wit and warmth, but she's basically made the entire film industry fall in love with her, off-screen as well as on-screen, which has really helped. Throughout award season, she's been a breath of fresh air. She's been so funny in interviews, in events, in speeches, and I think her Oscar speech just showed how charming she is. And basically, when Oscar voters vote, it's not just about the performance, it's also for the person as well. And I think that was the case here. They voted for her off camera as well as they did on camera.
Now, Sean, in the past, in the very rare cases that the Academy chose to commend actors of colour, they did tend to lean on stereotypes. How has Asian American and also the minority representation in cinema evolved throughout the years, or evolved at all? And what kind of representation do you think we should be looking for?
Well, I think it's telling that the last time an Asian woman won a Best Actor award of any type was in 1958, I believe. That was Miyoshi Umeki in Sayonara. And that was a very stereotypical role. I think the biggest change that we see today is that Asians and Asian Americans are occupying decision-making roles in the productions that they are part of. And the last few years, we've seen quite a few of those, from The Farewell by Lulu Wang, then there's Always Be My Maybe, Half of It. There's a whole bunch of romantic comedies that have, Asian American romantic comedies that have come out recently that has really changed the landscape of film representation for Asian Americans. So a lot of those are fair. I'm not saying a romantic comedy is the be-all and end-all of representation, but it does have a role in sort of educating the public in who is lovable, for example. And I think to the degree that film participates in normalizing human relationships, and there's been quite a lot of progress very recently, notwithstanding the efforts of longtime activist producers like Janet Yang and others. And of course, in the history of representation in Hollywood, there have always been independent movements, from Poverty Row to the Blaxploitation movement to UCLA's own LA Rebellion cinema, which featured a lot of African-American filmmakers. So I think there has been moments where representation has happened, and now we see a real call for that in the entertainment industry across the board.
And Jacob, Minari generated a lot of discussion on Asian American films and also the lack of diversity or acceptance of it in Hollywood as part of American culture. Do you think the atmosphere is changing now? Do you think the industry is becoming more inclusive? And moreover, is diversity really what viewers want to see?
Absolutely. For starters, it definitely is changing, I think. I did a study on the Oscars diversity in terms of nominations and wins across the last 10 years. And while improvement is not the quickest to happen, the last 5 years have shown a consistent improvement on diversity numbers. And this year absolutely is, in my opinion, the most diverse Oscars ever. I think groundbreaking nominations came from a lot of the big categories as well, which is really important, as Sean was saying. In the top categories, Asian creators had the best year they've ever had. Black creators had the best year that they've ever had. The first woman of colour won Best Director. So I think in the top categories where it really matters about who's deciding what stories to tell, there has been clear progress. And audiences, to answer your second question, absolutely do want diversity and representation. I spoke to the Academy CEO, Christine Simmons, and she told me that, which I think is very true, people who are underrepresented have money in their pockets that they want to go and spend at the cinema to see themselves on screen that they haven't had the chance to do before. That's why films like Black Panther or Love, Simon or Crazy Rich Asians always do well at the cinema, because people want to go and see themselves on screen. And that behooves the film studios to therefore be as diverse as they can, because at the end of the day, Hollywood is a business, and if they're going to get money from being diverse, they should do it. It might sound cynical, but it will help to bring more diversity in.
And Sean, now I'd love to hear your thoughts on this as well. I mean, Minari, it's seen as having received the attention that it did because it touched upon very universal themes as well, such as family and the struggles of being an immigrant in America. But it's also a unique film in its narrative of an Asian American immigrant family, one that's not so often told and certainly not highlighted in the central story of a movie. How is Hollywood starting to tell the stories of those who are in the margins, so to speak, those whose narratives and lives were neglected by the larger industry? Do you think this kind of narrative is appealing for the American audience?
I do, given the reception. I think one of the interesting contrasts is if you look at the film that featured Asian actors that did well recently, it's really different from Minari, right? So if we think of the Crazy Rich Asians as one example of a kind of over-the-top, really decadent, super rich lifestyle, Minari is almost the complete opposite, and I think it has a certain realism that appeals to the U.S. public right now, given the conditions that we're all living in. I also think that although it's received as universal, I think there's value in thinking about it in terms of how it's particular. And there's a lot of things that happen off screen that are just mentioned. For example, what motivates their migration across the country to Arkansas? Why does the lead character think that starting a Korean produce shop is going to be successful at this particular moment in US history? I think those kinds of elements in the film, in the narrative, they suggest that there's an investment in Korean culture transnationally. So what's happening in Korea is never really talked about, but we know that's part of what motivates people to migrate from Korea to the US in the first place. What happens to the farm industry in the 80s is also not really talked about, but we understand that that's part of what motivates this kind of initiative to start a Korean grocery. So I think there's a lot of things that are very particular about this story that speak to its moment, at the same time that you can read it as this sort of immigration story that seems to pertain to a lot of different cultural groups in the US.
So it seems that there's a vast diversity of themes to pick from within within Asian American narratives and other minority groups as well. But Sean, why do you think representation is still limited to Asians as comic relief or ridiculed minor characters? And how significant do you think the characterization of Asian Americans was in Minari?
I think it's important because it shows range. I mean, I'm not one to say representation is good or representation is bad. I think that representation is representation, and even in the 1950s, the Broadway industry had more Asian American parts than it did for 50 years thereafter. And one of the things that provided was opportunities for people to hone their craft. Were they productive representations? Not really. They're quite stereotypical, and yet they set the groundwork for people to come in later. I think in this moment that we're living in right now, where people are struggling economically, having a story that features Asian American communities that have not featured in the mainstream that much has been important. So if we think of Joy Luck Club and other films that feature middle class or above, this one really changes the focus. And I think that kind of focus has long been included in Asian American cinema specifically, that is independent Asian American cinema. But Hollywood hasn't really caught up to that yet. So I think they've just now started to think through, oh, this is a story. There's quite a lot of diversity in the Asian American communities that we might mine for audiences today.
Now, Jacob, of course, Minari was partly in English, partly in Korean, and it's not often that we see languages other than English being incorporated so well into the dialogue of an American film. How was that for you as a viewer and critic?
As a critic, it was just really impressive to watch, because I think Lee Isaac Chung's script is so well written, and it made the changes in the dialogue. The lines were specifically chosen to be either in Korean or English, so it was personal and thought out, but it also felt seamless and made a very smooth watch for the film, which just enhanced the story. As a viewer, which I think is probably more important. I think viewers get used to subtitles much quicker than they probably give themselves credit for. And I think what Sean was touching on is that Minari does not pander to audiences. It doesn't spoon feed them. It just tells the story in the best way possible. And I think that's true with subtitles. I think Minari is the sort of film that you could watch it with someone who say that they hate subtitles, and by the end they would go, that's not that bad, that was okay, and they'd really enjoy it, and that would open their eyes, I think, more to watching more films with subtitles or that are in English and another language. What I would say that it's happened before. Inglourious Basterds, for instance, was spoken in English and in French, Italian and German, and subtitles. No one seemed to mind that much. I do think that films of Asian languages have been treated a bit differently. Hollywood can be quite Eurocentric and Western-centric, but the more films like Minari that are made, then the more that this snowball effect will continue to gather pace.
But we are seeing some positive changes take place. And Jacob, well, this question goes to both of you, but let's start with you, Jacob. Awards such as the Oscars, they do seem a bit late to the game in recognising minorities, but what further developments do you hope to see in terms of making the movie industry more diverse and more inclusive?
Absolutely, but they definitely are late to the game. My conversation with Christine Simmons, the Academy COO, she was the first to admit that they've not done well enough, that they've been a bit reactive rather than proactive. But I think they are starting to realise, maybe still a tad too slow, but they are starting to realise their own power, that they can drive the change. For example, they're bringing in inclusion standards in 2024, where films won't be allowed to be nominated for Best Picture unless they meet certain diversity criteria. And Christine has already had film studios come to her and say, how can we make sure that we're in contention for Oscars in that year, even though it's 3 years away? And I just think that shows that the power that the Oscars still do have, and they can make sure that with their own power they can drive the change, as well as just wait for other film studios to make the films. So I think that we are seeing some difference. I think the Academy's recruiting of new voting memberships largely has been from international filmmakers as well, hence the reason why we're getting a lot of international and more diverse films that aren't just American being nominated. I think that's helping as well, but they do have a long way to go, yeah, I think.
Hopefully they will be more proactive in this though. And well, Sean, same question to you. What do you hope to see in order to continue seeing progress in diversity and inclusion in Hollywood?
I agree with Jacob, and I also think there needs to be a real effort to recruit people at all levels of the industry into the business, because right now we see certain stories being sold, but then they're given to producers or directors who don't necessarily understand the material, or they go through director after director, and then the story changes so much that it becomes unrecognizable. And I think that's a problem, because you lose any sense of the cultural tradition that this film is trying to speak to. And I would compare a film like Minari to Disney's Mulan, because Disney's Mulan had a huge budget and had real issues. And I think Minari had a very small budget, did really well. And one would think about, why is that the case? And if you look at Mulan, you can see that all the cultural signifiers, like North and South China, get mixed up. Qi becomes a superpower. There's all of these moments that you think, oh, this is not good. It doesn't speak to the culture in any way that seems at all realistic or authentic. Even for a fantastic story, the parameters are so blown out of anything recognizable as Chinese in some ways. So I think the more that you can bring people onto the team who know the culture and who can speak the language and who have grown up understanding what does it mean to, I think there's for example, what does it mean to act like a Korean man? I think those kinds of nuances are really important to see the Hollywood industry move forward.
I see. Well, this is where we're going to have to end the interview today, I'm afraid. But that was Jacob Sarkisian, entertainment reporter at Insider, and Sean Metzger, professor and associate dean of UCLA School of Theatre, Film and Television. Thank you both so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And to our viewers, as always, thank you very much for watching.